Did you know that over 10% of North America was under wetlands before European settlement? These were often the most productive parts of the landscape, so much so that the indigenous tribes sometimes went to war over harvesting rights. Europeans drained over half of these ecosystems so that they could plant their handful of domesticated crops that demanded drier conditions. What if they had arrived with a suite of staple crops that thrived in wetlands? Could the creation of such a set of species catalyze the restoration or even the expansion of these vibrant ecosystems across the entire planet? For an agricultural system to work, it needs a suite of complementary crops which produce a balanced output of carbohydrate, protein, and fat. In most traditional systems, the carbohydrates are produced by starchy grains in places that have a reliable dry season for harvest and storage, or large starchy tubers in consistently wet places. Protein often comes in the form of a complementary legume crop, which is sometimes lacking in tropical climates where protein deficiency is fairly common. Finally, an oilseed crop can supply the fat. In the famous Milpa or Three Sisters system, the maize produced the starch, the beans produced a storable form of protein, and the squash produced oil-rich seeds, though these were often complemented by sunflower or chia, the fourth or fifth sister in the system, depending on how you're counting. Wetlands contain a wide range of plants with domestication potential. To narrow our focus in this episode, I want to examine floating aquatic plants, a much more specialized niche. These plants need slow-flowing water to avoid being washed downstream, but an upside means that they can adapt to changes in water depth over their season much better than plants which are anchored to the bottom. So let's explore how we could develop 3 floating staple crops that could produce a useful harvest of starch, fat, and protein. Part 1. Starch. There are no promising floating plants that produce starchy tubers, but I think I found one that could produce grains with a little bit of tricky manipulation. So the first plant on my radar is called pickerel weed. The Latin name is Pontidaria cordata. It is a temperate water plant that grows all the way from Canada to Argentina, and it produces these beautiful blue flowers. I'm quite a fan of it. The flowers are followed by edible starchy seeds, which have been eaten raw, boiled, or ground into the flour by indigenous people throughout the Americas. The main problem with this species, for our narrow purposes, is that it grows from stems that are anchored in the mud, so that means it is limited to reliably shallow water. Luckily, I think I figured out a possible route around this limitation, thanks to one of the world's worst environmental weeds. Water hyacinth has a terrible reputation. Originally from the backwaters of South America, it since spread worldwide as an ornamental, and then went on to choke waterways anywhere that it wasn't killed off by freezes in the winter. Recently, water hyacinth has been reclassified from the genus Eichhornia into Pontidaria, right alongside our lovely pickerel weed. That made me wonder if it would be possible to hybridize pickerel weed with water hyacinth to produce a floating plant that also produces a nice crop of edible starchy seeds. So how would one go about investigating this possibility? One place to start is the chromosome count. Species that have the same chromosome count are more likely to hybridize easily, though there are many exceptions to this fuzzy rule in both directions. So just because you have the same chromosome count doesn't automatically mean that a hybrid is possible, and just because you have different chromosome counts doesn't mean that it's impossible. So pickerel weed has a diploid chromosome count. It has 16 chromosomes, while water hyacinth is a tetraploid with 32 chromosomes, twice as many. Crossing a plant with 2 sets of chromosomes against one with 4 usually produces a triploid with 3 sets, and having an odd number of chromosome sets like that means that the plants are usually sterile and have difficulty producing pollen and seeds. But you can double the number of chromosomes again, either spontaneously or you can help it along with a few chemicals that come from plants. And that will give you a hexaploid with 6 sets of chromosomes. And because that's an even number, you now have a fertile species again. And many domesticated crops were produced along this exact pathway. So it's been observed that the chromosome structure of water hyacinth is somewhat unstable. And this suggests that it might have been a relatively recent hybrid itself. If this cross between the tetraploid and the diploid species that are most commonly available, there's another option. There are 2 rarer floating species that are diploids called Pontidaria azurea and Pontidaria diversifolia. So if somebody could get their hands on those, which are possibly the parents of the water hyacinth hybrid, then it might be easier to cross them with pickerel weed. But yeah, that's a little bit of a treasure hunt to go on, trying to figure out where those much more uncommon species could be found. How would you go about producing these hybrids in practice? Firstly, you would ideally live in a place where you could get all of the species of interest growing and flowering and get your hands on them without restrictions. Many parts of the world, like Australia, it's illegal to grow water hyacinth because of eradication efforts. A subtropical climate would probably suit both the temperate pickerel weed and the more tropical hyacinth, water hyacinth species. And you'd need to get the various species to flower at the same time, since the structure of Pontidaria pollen means it's probably going to be difficult to store in a freezer. That's just a guess. It might be worth trying that if you have problems. But luckily, pickerel weed seems to flower in the spring, triggered by its cold weather dormancy breaking. So you could probably refrigerate pickerel weed plants at any time of the year. You might need to manipulate the day lengths as well through artificial lighting, but that's all relatively low-tech methods, at least in this time in history when we have electric lighting and refrigerators in most parts of the developed world. The floral anatomy and the pollination mechanism is pretty simple, so hand pollination should be easy if you can get them flowering at the same time. Once these initial crosses are made, then it's just a matter of growing out seedlings across many generations, observing their capacity to produce edible seed, and then selecting the most productive, tasty, and easy to grow varieties. The cold tolerance of pickerel weed means that the crop could possibly grow all the way from the temperate to the tropical zones, so the potential utility with regional adaptation is enormous. Part 2. Fat. Oil-producing crops are generally a lot less common than starchy ones, but there is one really remarkable candidate among the floating aquatic plants. Duckweed, lemna, and various other related genera are tiny floating plants that consist of a few oval-shaped leaves and sometimes a few tiny little roots trailing below in the water. And they're closely related to more familiar crops like taro and cocoyam that are in the Araceae, in the aroid family. These include, the duckweeds include the smallest and fastest growing plants known to man. And they usually reproduce by vegetative division under suitable conditions, though they can also be induced to flower and produce seed as well, with the right triggers of light and temperature, and sometimes hormones. Artificial hormones can be applied to bring that on. And there's a few dozen species that range from temperate to tropical locations. A smaller relative of the lemna duckweeds is called wolffia, and it's even smaller. It was historically consumed in Asia since it lacks the defensive calcium oxalate crystals that are found in most of the other duckweeds that limit them to use in animal feed. And they also contain other defense compounds, which are a little bit of a concern, but potentially manageable. So, luckily, all of the defenses that are found in this group of duckweeds are water-soluble. So, in principle, duckweed could be pressed, like olives or various other oil crops, and the oil extracted into a safe, edible product. So, how much oil do the existing strains of duckweed contain? Wild strains of duckweed contain between 1 and 8% crude fat content relative to their dry biomass. Not that promising as an oil crop, which are often much higher in their fat content. The fat is also mostly polyunsaturated fat, like most plants, which means that it starts oxidizing as soon as it is extracted and continues to degrade inside the body after consumption. And we now know this has a lot of negative health effects. Conventional hybridization of duckweeds could be a useful option here. With a few dozen species, there are recorded natural crosses, and there's a mix of diploid, triploid, and tetraploid forms among the existing species. The tiny, tiny size of these plants means that artificial hand crossing is challenging, but with microscopes and a basic lab, it has been recently demonstrated to be possible. So, combined with testing of the oil yield and composition, this could open up the long road to developing a functional oil crop duckweed strain. But there might be an even faster way forward. Recently, duckweeds have demonstrated a spectacular ease of genetic manipulation. They readily absorb foreign genes and express novel traits rapidly because they grow so fast and they're so tiny. So, in a laboratory situation, they're actually pretty much the ideal model organism for manipulation. The full genome of several species has been sequenced, and these genomes are among the smallest known in the entire plant family, which makes them also easier to understand and manipulate. In parallel with this, the genetic pathways for plant fatty acid synthesis are very well characterized, and this knowledge has been used to select crops like sunflower to shift their fat production from unstable polyunsaturated fats into more stable and healthy monounsaturated fats. And you might have seen high oleic sunflower oil in various products in the shops. This was created using this form of targeted breeding. You really just need to know what composition is in all of the various strains that you're working with, and then you can start selectively breeding for the ones that produce the better monounsaturated fats. So a combination of all of these techniques could quite rapidly lead to a duckweed strain which produces a high enough yield of monounsaturated fat to be worth cultivating in a floating plant habitat, and then scooped up and pressed to release all of that lovely edible oil. Part 3. Protein. Normally, staple legume crops find themselves serving as the source of cheap and storable protein in agricultural ecosystems whenever you can't get animals to do a better job. And legumes have the advantage of often fixing nitrogen directly from the air, which supports their production of a nitrogen-rich protein as a yield. However, legumes aren't the only plants to develop this trick, and there aren't many legumes that really like growing in really wet areas. There's a couple of candidates, but they look like a bit of a long shot, particularly if we're going to limit ourselves to floating plants. So, among the floating plants, there is a primitive fern that stands out as an amazing nitrogen fixer. This is the fuzzy little floating fern called Azolla. This genus evolved 80 million years ago, and that was 20 million years before the legumes first appeared. And a bit of interesting trivia, around 55 million years ago, during a really, really warm period of the Earth, the North Pole formed this huge freshwater ocean, and that grew so much Azolla that drew down all of the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and that actually triggered the current ice age that we're still living in. We are in an ice age because there's ice at the poles. So the direct edibility of Azolla for humans is contested. It is established for producing protein-rich feed for animals, but the presence of potentially contaminating unnatural amino acids, there's one particular called BMAA, which is linked to neurodegeneration. There's a host of other anti-nutritive compounds that are present that limit its direct use as human food. So, you can feed Azolla to animals, and that's one simple pathway for protein production. But ideally, we want to find a way to make a storable form of protein. And animal protein can be dried and smoked, but this consumes a lot of fuel and labor. It's not a form that naturally preserves itself like the best plant-based forms of protein can do. So let's keep thinking. So One option would be to breed or engineer the azolla to be more edible, and then also breed it to be better for drying directly. But it's a challenge to do that in a wetland ecosystem. So, what if we found a better method of transformation than feeding it to animals? What if we look beyond the plant and animal trees of life for a suitable collaborator? So, oyster mushrooms have developed a reputation for growing on a wide range of substances, providing that the protein levels are high enough relative to the digestible carbohydrates. In such a system, azolla could be used as a protein-rich ingredient, which is blended with high carbon biomass, possibly as a leftover product from the water hyacinth crop after it's harvested. This could be compressed into blocks, possibly using the same equipment as a duckweed oil press, and then these blocks could be inoculated with mushroom spores. And once the mushrooms fruit, they can be dried much more readily than either plant matter or animal protein into a form which stores for months or even years and is lightweight enough to be easy to transport. Conclusion. Bringing all this together, what would an integrated system based on these 3 floating aquatic plants look like? Paddies and other managed wetlands could be generated and maintained, but the water levels would not need to be managed as precisely as are currently done for emergent plants like rice. This would give a much wider operational resilience and reduce the demand for carefully timed water pumping, which is a major drain of labor and energy in current rice paddy systems. Another benefit is that these wetlands would not need to be ploughed or planted like rice and taro. Instead, the floating crop could simply be introduced in sufficient quantities to rapidly cover the surface. Duckweed and azolla could be harvested continuously throughout the growing season and processed into storable forms. And rather than moving humans through the wetland to harvest the crop, as needed for rice and taro, controlled water flow could deliver the crop biomass to a collection point located right beside your processing equipment, massively reducing energy and labor requirements. Duckweed and azolla are among the fastest growing plants known, provided sufficient phosphorus and other minerals are available. The processing of these 2 crops after harvest should render the use of human effluent relatively safe in these systems, as parasites and pathogens should not easily transmit back into the edible products. Unlike tubers such as taro, which are pulled from the mud and have to be very carefully washed and peeled before they're cooked. Production of carbohydrates from the hybrid water hyacinth might be limited to seasonal triggers such as changes in day length, but perhaps different strains could be developed to spread out the harvest across the year. Selectively harvesting the seeds might be a bit more complex than azolla or duckweed, where the entire biomass is gathered, but perhaps a cutting mechanism could be carefully spaced above the water level, combined with breeding for upright flowering stalks that are held above the foliage, which would make a flow-based harvest possible for this crop as well. The resulting crop would need to be spread out to dry in the sun, or possibly dried in enormous kilns that are fueled by burning methane gas generated by fermenting surplus biomass. The same infrastructure could be used to dry mushrooms. A vision.
Here in Mahuli Nangka, we have been growing makana since many centuries, the water lily that is covered all over in spines. It gives such lovely edible seed, prized so much in all of India. Your scientists are calling it Juliale Felox, but it was always makana only. When the river shifted in my grandparents' time itself, it became much harder to keep makana happy. Perhaps the weather was dry and the water was dropping too low. Other times, too much wet. And all of a sudden the water became too deep. We were always fighting with the river. Always we were losing only. Then the rice hyacinth came to the village. Maybe from Laos, people were saying. Maybe from Brazil. The grains were popping just like bacana. very tasty, most finding good acceptance in the market. Since it was floating, we were having much less problem in growing it. We even wove bamboo cages and tied them up so they would not wash away in the floods. That meant we could pull the rafts to shore one by one at the time of harvest. Soon we were not missing those spines under the kana stalks anymore. Next, the oil weed came from Vietnam. It was looking just like duckweed, or how you say duckweed, but when you rubbed it between your fingers, it felt just like ghee. Someone purchased a press and was soon rafting it from farm to farm. And then we saved up money to buy our own press, and then a chamber on our highest ground with thick walls of brick. With a new, very special variety of azolla from Japan, we learned to make bricks from the leftover water plants, bricks which grow such delicious pink pale mushrooms. It took some practice only, but our traditional sabzi, made with macana seeds simmered in cream with vegetables, has changed for the better. We are now making it with hyacinth rice seeds in a rich gravy of duckweed oil, packed with sautéed oyster mushrooms and bursting with cumin, fennel, fenugreek, turmeric, ginger, and chili. Some of the older folk were objecting to all the strange new ingredients. I had to remind them that in their great-great-great-grandparents' time itself, chili had come from Mexico for the first time, and India embraced it wholeheartedly. Just like the course of a river, the traditions of a people must change and flow in response to every obstacle and opportunity.
If you would like to support everything I do solo on this podcast, please buy a copy of Taming the Apocalypse, a book where I explore the entire tree of life for all the major domestication potentials, like the ones we've discussed here today, across the entire tree of life. So you can access that as an audiobook on Kobo, or as an ebook through Amazon, or you could get a paid subscription to my Substack where the audiobook is also available. Next week, I have a conversation with Damon Zubroagel, an architect who bought a rundown farm in the middle of Burma and restored it to health.